Hemshech Ayin Beis, we're middle of chapter 135, page 262. Okay, a fascinating detail. The Rebbe Rashab is dissecting the Meichen Midas relationship, the way our mind and our heart communicate with each other. We really can break it down to many different levels. As I said, it seems to me there are 4 key levels of Meichen. In the Kabbalistic terminology, it's Yaakov, Yisrael Zuta, which is called Nar Yisrael, Yisrael Saba, which is Shema Yisrael, that's Abba V'Ima Tatoin, and Abba V'Ima Eloyin, which is the higher Yichud, the Yichud that creates, the unification that creates something new. So from the top down, the Yichud that creates something new is Abba V'Ima Eloyin, which we didn't even get to yet. It's Meichen Be'etzem, as he calls it. Atzmus HaMeichen, actually, core mind. Next level is Abba V'Ima Eloyin. It's in the mind still, but it's not the core, it's not Etzem. That's Yisrael Saba. As he said, Yisrael Saba is Meichen of Chachmeh, and Yichud, Yisrael Saba V'Tfuna, is connecting the Meichen of Abba with Meichen of Ima. Tfuna is Bina. Then comes the next 2 steps, which are in Midas. So you have Yisrael Zuta, let's start bottom up, Yaakov, which is primarily the focuses on the emotion, the feeling. You don't yet have, the intellect is only to support and to give a little reason of why you like it, why not. He brought the example of a psak halacha, and you just have the reason for it. It conceals the whole intellectual process behind it. And even the little that you do think, it's all chetzenis haseichel. It's all about what is in it for me. Chayecha in Aveda. God gives me life, so I appreciate God. So it's a little intellect, but it's mostly about survival. Not necessarily negative, it could be in Kedusha, but it's the lowest level of a child, let's say, respecting a parent, because the parent provides for the child. Then comes a level where you're not focusing on your need. It's still midas, it's still excitement of a midah, but the midah has been matured now by a magadlos hameichen. So the mind, as a person grows, is no longer into, okay, what's in it for me, so to speak, this candy or this toy. You're focusing now on the value of godliness, let's say, itself. But it's primarily still midah because it's about a mature midah now. So instead of a midah just being selfishness and narcissism or okay, let's not say negative, in the positive, just about chayecha, that's your life, you're focusing God. It's a midah, it's awakening a midah, like he says. It makes you, as he said, the example, makes you excited. You're learning Torah, you're verkocht to come midatach bei. Or Rabbi Shimon who kisses because he heard something new. So it's an emotional experience informed by a more mature intellect, but it's still midas. That's Yisrael Zuta. And now in chapter Kuf Lamed Hey, he moved over now to Yisrael Saba. And hem etzem hameichen shalamaylam midas shabalav. But he begins to explain that this too is midas. Like Shebameichen Gufa, this is the midas shebehem. So now we talked before meichen shebemidas. Now we're talking about midas shebameichen. So now the main focus is the intellectual process. So he says, and here's where he says that the midas shebachachim is Yisrael Saba. Okay, we're talking about Shema Yisrael, and the midas shebabina, that's tfuna. That's tfuna. Okay. And he says, in midas elu ein zeh shem b'chinas hispalus u'kedugmas hispalus hamidas shebalev. Midas shebalev, there's an actual excitement. You're learning something, you're getting excited about it. So your emotions are being informed by something that is far more superior than just your survival. But it's still an emotional experience. Here, it doesn't have that hispalus. And to explain this, he says, in midas shebaseichel, there's 2 things. And we began learning the first thing. The first thing is hispalus sichli. That b'shas you're concentrating on learning something, just a second. I should add one more thing in the second level of Yisrael Zuta. he said, because the focus is on that idea, the Hergesh Halev is not so revealed, even though it's much more intense. So the focus is still emotional, but the emotional expression is not quite as apparent. It sounds similar to what we learned about Meichin Be'etzim. That's why I stopped, because in there too, when you focus on Chayecha in your life, Yaakov, the level of Yaakov, so there the emotion is very direct. It's about me. That's clear, with a little tam, a little reason, a little seichel behind it. When you're focusing on a more exalted concept, the godliness itself, so it's still an emotional excitement, but the emotional excitement is not as apparent, though in intensity it's far deeper, because you're talking about something that is closer to, it's like he says, the seichel is mechazik the midah, and it's part of the, so it's not just not more geshes as much. In other words, let's put it this way: a child, you'll see far more excitement in a revealed way than an adult, let's say, learning Torah. But the real midah is far more by an adult. It's just a mature midah, because the seichel is right now is when they're learning. But when he expresses himself, starts kissing, or he's kochen sich in it, the spilus is far more profound than the child's spilus, which is a much more, let's call it the mature style, the mature approach. Just wanted to add that. But now let's go back to midah shebemechin. So he's saying, Sol Shabbos. He says there's two things. The first thing is the spilus. There's an excitement, ba'ava, b'yira, according to what you're contemplating or meditating on. It's mamash spilus, just like the excitement that you have in the heart. However, it's far more subtle. So clearly he's now distinguishing, and we discussed this. This is far more subtle, because what you're talking here is the midah that's within the mind. It's not how the mind is informing the emotion to develop into something and appreciate, let's call it, more superior things, more quality things than just survival. Here the focus is on the mind, but the mind does create some excitement, but it's dakas yeser. And then the parentheses, which we elaborated upon, he said that in this too, there's two levels. There's when you're completely immersed and the idea takes control of you. You can't even feel anything, because there's no you to feel. You're now submerged, like we spoke in the mikveh, meidas atar. Not that there's a starke reichkeit in it. There's a richness, there's a very strong richness in it, but you're not in a place to feel it, because you're just in it. You're experiencing it, you're not feeling it. So you're like, when you're in it, you can't observe it, so to speak. When you're not focusing on the depth of the idea, so you're somewhat a little outside of it, so there's a sensation. All this is midas shebemechin in Yisrael Saba. And then we continue to say, like it is in Chachma, because it says Yisrael Saba is Chachma, is what? The main thing is dveikus. You feel a connection to something, you feel cleaving to something. Not so much, the excitement is not so apparent. Then he goes on and says that now there's another thing in midas that are not, we don't define them by excitement or by emotion, we find them by expression, inclination. And he went into this difference between meichin and midas. The meichin can be done without anyone else, you don't need another person, and midas you need another. What is it in the root? Because one is an atzmi and one is a gili. An atzmi fundamentally does not require anything but himself. A gilui, aispashtus, it by definition means it's about expressing. You know, in the worst possible way, when we say, for example, in Chassidish language, this is a chitzin, this is a pnimi. What's a chitzin? A chitzin is a person who does things that people should compliment him. You know, it's a chitzin. It's a person who's on the outside. You know, yeah. A pnimi is somebody. He's not using the word pnimi here. He used the word atzmi. Atzmi is even deeper than a pnimi. But a pnimi is somebody that doesn't matter if someone's watching. You see him doing things, even if there's no one around. It just you see he's an inner person in that sense. You ask me, it doesn't mean introvert necessarily. Chochmah does have the tendency, like we say sometimes, marashcheda, or the tendency of being a loner, being more introvert. But it's not the introvert part. The key here is that the person doesn't need others, doesn't need to perform. Some people need to perform, and some people don't need to perform because they are what they are. They're just real. They don't need someone else to recognize that realness, so to speak. So that's in the Shadish, he says. That's what he calls Yisod Ayin Hamavur. That's Yisod. And what is it? Where's the expression that I'm saying here? Sibas HaHefresh Hazeh. It's very important when the Rebbe Rashab uses the word Sibas HaHefresh, it's giving you a methodology. He's telling you, and the reason for it is because Meichen and Midas are rooted. That one is Meichen and Atzmim, Chol Etzim Biltim Izgala, and Midas Ein Nas Ha'ara. And Ha'ara is a spashta. So if you go to the root of Meichen and Midas, basically it's the Etzim and the Ha'ara. They're not even called Meichen and Midas yet. You can't even call them intellect and feelings. When they evolve, that will be, so this is like the soul personality. So, when you want to dissect something, you don't want to just dissect what it is, you want to dissect what is its soul, what is its inner significance. So its inner significance is Etzem and Gili. Okay. And we stopped here before the parentheses. Now, what I'm not clear yet, and what I'm sure will become clear, is when he said in the beginning of the chapter, he says, I think this, what he just said, is the second thing, because he doesn't say habeis, which he usually does. That it's not, the omnam can be yesh b'chinas midas, she'ein b'chinas ispalos. I'm not sure. It could be means he's still talking in that same level, or maybe not. We'll find out, but we're still in the middle of the discussion of midas shebemeichen. Now he's going to say v'yesh leimer, another parenthesis. He's going to explain the difference between meichen and midas. That this is like similar to rotzen and einig. It's a very important parenthesis, because if you remember all the way in the first chapter of Ayin Beis, he spoke about keser is the interface. Keser is the interface. And he says it's rotzen. And he spoke there how rotzen means an atiyah to something. The whole idea of rotzen is a meshicha. That he's inclined to something. Without a rotzen for something, you have no relationship with it. But he spoke there also, if you recall, I don't know if you recall, but if you don't recall, I'll remind you, he spoke there that he spoke in the, also parentheses, that there's an Ayin of just having, a melech has just pleasure, and he's just merutza from the word content, just from Zreima Musatzme. And it's not even any form of connection to anything else. He says in the rotzen, it's not that he desires something. It's a gili la'atzmei. It's no relationship with anything. Now in Meichen Midas, he's going to equate these two things, etzem and gili, to Meichen Midas, and now to rotzen and tainug. I just want to say one thing before we read the parentheses. It's very important when you discuss, especially this thing, because he's now not talking in El Misalyenim. He's talking now human qualities. Meichen, Midas, intellect, emotions. Even Akudim and Atzilus and Akudim and Ak and Livnei Atzimtzum also need to be applied in our personal lives. But this is what we're made of, Meichen and Midas. So remember, even Akudim we discussed was the seed, etc. So I just want to say one thing. There's a very beautiful sikha. It's in Tafshin Mem Ches. It's a bir on Pirkei Avos. I'm trying to remember what Mishnah. It could be the Mishnah of Ezu Chacham Reis Anelad, Ezu Gibur Kevish Sitzre, Ezu Asher Samech Bechalke, and Ezu Mechubed Mechabed Sabriyas. I think it's that Mishnah. Maybe I may be wrong, but it's a beautiful explanation on this idea of Meichen and Midas in a very relevant way. So let's just define it for a moment. Each person, each of us, has two ways of two modes, let's call it, two modes. One mode is the mode of when you are interacting and relating to other people. And another is a mode when you're interacting and relating to yourself. Many people don't give it much thought. It's almost automatic. It's like, when you're by yourself in the shower, you're going to sing songs or do other things that you won't do in public. So there's experience, how a person experiences within themselves, which is essentially what Moichen is really about. And Midas is our relationship with others. So you can completely relate to what he's saying here. Now, obviously, there are people whose Moichen is not necessarily so developed, and it's controlled more by Midas. But nevertheless, everybody, in some subtle way, everybody has these two modes. Everybody has these two modes. And they are reflective of what he calls here Etzem and Gili. Now, some people just can't stand being alone. because they're not secure, or they don't know what to do with themselves. They're only good when they're in a party with other people. It's a person who probably has not become aware of his own etzem, so he's mostly into giluyim, into expression. There are other people who are very much atzmim, they don't know how to go out of themselves. Obviously, you need a balance of the two. And the purpose of creation, God himself is an atzmi that expressed himself in giluyim. So we too need to find the balance of etzem and gilui. And you'll find people who are real atzmim, like the Rabbi, you'll see there's a certain privacy about them that you never get, no matter how public they are. They're extremely private as well. Because in the public you only see a certain dimension. You don't see what the person is really like when you're with them personally. Real atzmim are this way. They have both elements to them. So I'm just trying to find a way to identify something like this in our own lives. And obviously, there's an aveda involved with it, meaning that a person can work on this by understanding. A lot of people, for example, we grow up in environments that are very critical environments, with the parents that are critical, or schools that are critical, or a system that's judgmental. What it usually tends to do to children is it tends to hide their etzem. So the etzem goes into hiding because it was never reinforced and never encouraged. And you're constantly knocked. So you become somebody to satisfy other people. You become a pleaser. It's not longer you. You become whatever makes people happy, because you don't want to be criticized. You don't want to, you want to just fit in. And unfortunately, what happens is the etzem of the person, what he's really about, goes into hiding, and it becomes dormant, and it could be hiding for years and years. And what you see the person behaving is completely a show. I don't mean a show that he's actively putting on a show. He's learned from a long time ago that you don't rock the boat. You don't say what you think. You don't really express yourself because others might not like it, or others are going to judge it and stuff like that. In a healthy environment, so a person learns confidence, and that when they grow older, they express themselves. It doesn't mean they have to be fiercely independent to the point that they step on everybody and say, only my way. That's the other extreme, where a person is just about me. But they're not afraid to express themselves, and they're confident in a certain sense. And they're also confident to be disagreed with. You could disagree with a person like that, and they could discuss it. There's a balance. A person is secure enough to be able to be challenged too. So it's not just, when I say confidence, self-confidence doesn't mean you're always right. Self-confidence means that you are not silenced, that you speak up. And as you speak up, you have a normal relationship. Problem is, what happens when the two types marry each other, and one is the one type, one is the other type. It gets more complicated, obviously. But the point is, everybody has these two dimensions. The question whether it's developed by you or not is the second question. But there's no question that everybody has these two sides to them. And you could identify a person very quickly whether their etzem needs more work or their giluyim need more work. And that should be, more importantly, that the giluyim should be aligned with their etzem. It's not just the giluyim is like, I'm an actor, so I act like this, and my etzem is something else completely. And that's a big part of, you talk about Aveda, a part of developing a person, self-awareness. It'd be interesting if you go to a mashpia and a good person who really can see a soul, can understand you. What's the proportion? You say, you know me. So what would you say? Where's my etzem? Where's my giluyim? How aligned are they? How far are they apart? Am I completely just performing? Is it 5%, 10%, 100%? It's never 100%, but it's an important way of measuring where you are with your life. And obviously you want to build somebody's inner confidence that they should know that they could express and want to express their etzem. Just trying to apply this to a real model that works. So these ideas here, this is relatively actually very direct. He's saying it's almost directly. I just wanted to add the point that you can literally speak about yourself in this context. Now you say, what does that have to do with meichen and midas per se? It has to do. It's not perfectly made because he says it's etzem and gilui. But yes, meichen and midas is a big part of it. Because what is meichen at the end of the day? Is a person who has to be able to sit on his own, not wait to hear someone else's opinion. Some people say, tell me everyone's opinion, then I'll tell you my opinion. Don't tell me your opinion before everybody's opinion. That you need to be a little confident in yourself. So meichen by its nature is the ability to sit and be maskil askalos, like he says, la'atzmei. You don't need to hear, like the Ipchim Estavra guy, that you tell me what you say and I'll slug it up. Or somebody does. You see this all the time. I have this many times. You say something and people argue. I've got no problem. Then I say, okay, so what do you suggest? Silence. Only when I say something, they're only good to slug up what you're saying. I'm not saying, I know where it's coming from. It's coming from that they have some seichel, they haven't yet developed an ability to say an idea on their own, but they've definitely, so the way they compensate for it is by showing that they're smart enough to show that they disagree with you. Which I don't have a problem with, because, fine, you may have a legitimate point in disagreeing, but you can't really have a full conversation if there's no, you just tell me your position, here's my position, let's argue about it, I'll tell you what I think, you think, and you get somewhere. If not, what you're left with is just, okay, the idea doesn't work, so what do we do now? How do we explain it? We need an alternative always. Anyway, the point I'm making here is that this applies. Midas is obviously Midas is expression, and Midas unfortunately can be not controlled by Meichen, can become something that you're just completely reacting to. You're always reacting. You're never proactive. You're always reacting to someone else. And that again comes from the same type of problem. So really the goal is to have Meichen and Midas that are self-generated, that are coming from within, that the Etzem expresses itself to some extent. Even though he is saying here the Etzem built in Mizgala, but obviously he's also saying how Meichen Midas is inside of Meichen, etc., etc. And he's speaking about, which he didn't really finish this point, he just said that Midas, in this case, is not hispilus, it's expression. This is the key point here. Where before we talked about Midas as excitement or as feeling, now it's about expression. Gili. Expressing yourself.
Deeper meaning of Midas.
He doesn't say deeper, he just says Omnom. It seems maybe probably higher, because the more expression there is, the more less air there is. It's more. We'll see, but he's going to probably go back to this.
Even with the Malachim, we see that those that the Rashkada was not.
Yeah. And also, we keep learning here. The more you're in experience, the less the hergish. It's like the Aveda of Kayan and B'Chashay. And the Levim with Benigan or Keteris. Like you say, when the Karbonos and the Bezbeach HaChitzin, they made noise, because when you're burning something that has resistance, it crackles. Keteris was silent, because it's not Birur HaNefesh HaBamis, the Behema, Korban, it's the Aliyah of the Nefesh HaLekis. So it's two different Avedas, it's like Chuvit Tatar, Chuvla. One is, like you throw wet logs in the fire, it's going to sparkle and noise and make a racket. When it burns quietly, silently, it's a sign faket that it's far more deeper fire and much more aligned with the fuel and the fire are very seamless. So there's no question about it. They say a puske macht was atumul. Wie geht die Lashon? A puske kriegt man. That's one expression. No, a pushke. When you have one coin in a pushke, it makes a lot of noise. When the pushka is full, it doesn't make any noise. So when there's a lot of noise, it's usually... The Rebbe has this whole sikha about it with the bells of the Kohanim that they wore. Why do you need sound when you're in Aveda when there's no sound? The whole idea of measuring sound, not sound, beyond sound. The sound of silence. V'yesh leimer, so we continue on page 262. V'yesh leimer, so gam ken hafesh ben rotzen leinik. We can say this is also the difference between desire and pleasure. Or rotzen, will and pleasure. The rotzen who begins merutz v'amshochen. Rotzen is merutze v'amshochen. Merutze here, not from the word content. Sometimes merutze means, is content. Here merutze means from the word like rotz, to run. Merutze v'amshochen, that he's drawn to and extends to inclination. Shenimshech la'ezer davar. I want something. What means want? Just say the word want. Want means I am now drawn to this and I want it.
No. We want Mashiach, not Rabbi always said, so want is also lacking. The word want is the same translation as lacking. Why do you want it? Because you're lacking it. Okay,
but here he's focusing on the Hamshachah v'tiyas. V'ima yesh zo Hamshachah v'tiyas ha'atzmus. Because obviously Rotzen and Midas are not exactly the same thing. Midas is an actual attraction to something. I'm attracted to a piece of ice cream. I actually am. Come to think of it. Not right now. My grandmother was not allowed to really eat chocolate, but she loved chocolate. But she couldn't move around, so she was asking one of the grandchildren, and they said there's no chocolate. So she calls over my daughter, I remember, She says, she was a little girl, she says, tell me, the chocolate that we don't have in the house, is it milchik or parv? You know? So let's begin with that.
It's called the sweet tooth.
After I heard the professor here talk about gelato with milk whipped cream, I mean, yeah? You still thinking about it?
No, only since you brought it up.
Yeah. I looked everywhere in Chassidus. Glida doesn't have a sheirish and ruchnis anywhere.
Oh,
Glida, ice cream.
That's good.
Sheleg does.
Now I don't have to feel so bad that I didn't see the show.
Why not the man?
The man?
Yeah, it was Geblet. It was Geblet. It was like a...
Yeah, but the man had no taste and no color. It was like the ridiculous. Whatever you wanted to taste. Imagine eating a piece of broccoli and taste whatever you want to taste. It's not. I can't. Taste means that it's this taste and not that taste. That's the whole beauty of taste. That's what the Jews didn't like. If you have too many options, it's no good. You ever go to a restaurant where there's it's like a book, like an encyclopedia, like 55 pages, like every option, and where do you begin?
It was a restaurant there, and he served two different things.
Yeah.
It was a great restaurant. In the old days.
The old days.
All the same time.
Well, so he says like this. So even though so I was saying, midah is an attraction, an emotional attraction to something. Ratzon is the desire, the inclination to have it. It doesn't even have to have an emotion necessarily. It's like far higher than that. She's saying that this is the same, but the difference of etzem and gilui, the etzem that is to yourself and gilui to expression, is ratzon. So he says, ratzon berutzim amshachas, and even though it's the extension and the inclination of the atzmus, of the core, no, it's why are you saying that it's like midas? We just said midas is gilui, not etzem. Etzem doesn't extend itself. Here you're saying that ratzon is like in of extension. It's an etzem. So he's saying no. So in the etzem itself, more dakasdik. Meichen and midas, meichen is etzem, so it's to yourself, and midas is expressing to others. In etzem itself, which is the ratzon, there's also a subtle element of inclination. That's what he's saying here. In the etzem, masha etzem nimshach leizer dover. It's only a reflection of atzmus. So he's now adding a new level. We have etzem, we have gili, and now we have a horas etzem. That's ratzon. It doesn't end, right? Just when you think, when that thing was Jaws, when Steven Spielberg gave out that film called Jaws about sharks. So the ad for the ad, I always use it. It's a very good ad. It was in the summer. It was a summer film. So they wanted. It was in that yeah, Lamed Zayin. Same year when Ayin Beis was published. So there's Atzad HaShova.
Yeah.
Lahavdul Elef Havdalas. But Steven Spielberg was Jewish. He has a chelik of the Kamal Mamish. And Jaws became more popular than Ayin Beis so far. We're catching up now. It's a bislach. So the ad for it was just when you thought it was safe to get back into the water. So people were going to beaches and everyone was like, yeah, I remember, just when you were safe. So I always say, just when you thought you were safe and it was all understood, the Rebbe Rashab Gita Hafara Rein with a whole new dimension of this. So just when you felt you were safe. It's like Yaakov Bikish Yaakov Lezer B'Shalva. That's he thought he can now rest in peace. No, it's Koftzal of Rugzei Shal Yesh. That's that. Okay, my friends. So here we go. So now we have an etzem, ha'ara of an etzem. Very nice. That's ratzon. U'lechem shem ratzon shayach ba'er. And that's why the name ratzon is appropriate and fitting where there's eir. If you remember, he said Eidein Sav Be'etzem doesn't even have the name Ratzon. Ratzon comes afterwards. Why? Because Ratzon is not the Etzem. Ratzon is already a Tziyur. I desire something. It's no longer I. I desire is more than just I. So that desire creates some type of Tziyur, some type of inclination. And that's why however, it's not like Meichen and Midas, which are imminent faculties, it's still Makif. So remember the whole discussion, Lifnei HaTzimtzum. It's still Ratzon, it's still Makif, but it's now already no longer the level of Ein Sof, the field of energy that is shapeless. And it's beginning to something is beginning to stir.
In the stillness.
In the stillness, right. So it's not total stillness anymore. Ratzon is not stillness. Yeah, that's correct. It's a very good way to put it. He did it, I think.
Also, the core union of Eir is the Chechet union from Gilu, the Etzem.
But then there's Etzem.
The Shadel, the Rotzen from Dortmund.
This we discussed earlier.
Because
it's
relatively speaking.
It's relatively speaking. Of course, it's relatively speaking. Like he says, the word that where there's a silence, says it begins to stir.
Mm-hmm.
But silence is the word. Stillness. I remember one of the camp songs was "When all was still, it arose in His will." It's a very good way of expressing. We learned it. Bereish Hormanisa de Malka, right? Gol of Galifu, Petiri Allah. So there's a process. Now, obviously, not in time. It's in Madregas. Like so, I talked about ourselves. An Atzmi now wants to, let's say, a Rebbe. He's an Atzmi. He wants to now say a Maimer. He wants to now come and Fabreng. So there's how he is himself, the Etzem. We're not talking about a superficial, artificial person. We're talking about a real Atzmi. But the Atzmi, there's the stillness when he's in his own so-called place. And then there's how he's now going to express himself. This is really the essence of all the whole discussion Ayin Beis, that without the Ratzon, you don't have... Now obviously, Kol Yochel, God didn't need no Ratzon, he could do whatever he wants and so on. But again, it's always a structure that we can relate to. Because we need to be able to say all the B'Tzein. When we say Yehi Ratzon, the Eibishter, so to speak, decreed it should be so and so, and you say Yehi Ratzon Milfanecha, you should change your plan. So there's a process here. There's a Ratzon. You want to change my Ratzon, you have to go deeper into the Bala Ratzon, so to speak, and reach deeper. So the point here is that, yes, there's the point he wants to say that the Ratzon is similar to Midas, but in the Etzem level. It's not Etzem Mamish, he says it's Ha'ara from the Etzem. That's really what he's doing here. But even there, it's Bechinas Makif. Ratzon is not a Pnimi. Ratzon is in the form of Makif. It's detached, removed, aloof. Bechinas Makif le'elmas. Aval er be'etzem is Shayach Shem Ratzon. But on the actual, you can't call it a name Ratzon. Commission is Bar Le'el Perek Nun Zayit, like we learned before, chapter 57. So what do we see from this? That Ratzon is not just it's a Ha'ara. It's in Eir Guf, it's a lower level. Forget about the Etzem. Va'eneg, and Eneg on the other hand is like Meichen, on a higher level, obviously. It's not a drawing, an extension, or an expression. Spashtus is extension. Spashtus, spreading out. Shachet, an extension and an expression, and spreading out. That's why Tainug is also possible just to yourself. Like a person who has pleasure from Etzem Atzma Shaleh, just from his being. He just has a type of inner pleasure, inner contentment, we could say, an inner peace.
That's a very tough target to reach.
It's not.
If you read back in chapter 1, he describes it a little more. This level, he calls it like this. He says, "Mitainuk shemesanik by etzem shalei. Aval ein ze inyan ha'ili agili be'emes." He says that's not a gili when you have that tainuk in yourself. Why? Adra b'chinas aliyah v'reimus yeser b'ha'atzmus. Val kein ha'enig tainuk kazeh hu dafke b'misha merumim ba'etzem u'bezman tachlis harem shlei k'may hamelech b'tachlis harem shlei shemesanik ba'tainuk poshet v'atzmi loy me'ezer dover kim ba'etzem reimus atzmi.
has no expression?
No. We all have elements of this. An example would be there are times, no matter how fearful or insecure or performer you are or pleaser or whatever it is that we're doing to be Yetzer because we're adjusting to other people, I don't think there's a person on this earth that does not have moments that could be described as being an Etzem moment. An example would be when you have a birth of a child. You completely forget about yourself. You're not thinking about your fears and my successes and failures, blah, blah, blah. Just a moment of magic. Something happens that just is so overwhelming. And at that moment, it's not about performing, you're not even thinking about it. It's not even about for yourself, it's just I'm just giving an example. I don't think this is a full-blown Masanic Be'etzem Matzmusei, obviously. Yeah. But it's definitely a taste of it. So imagine a person has extended periods of it. They don't have to wait for a simcha. They're able to just connect to the neshama and just have that type of have that type of inner satisfaction. And here we're not talking about satisfaction as in indulgence, as in Nochgabenzich or something. It's just a certain peace with your life, with your being, basically. Obviously, a person who is worked on himself is able to access it far easier. But remember, it's not a person who's able to sit and say, "Oh, look how special I am," and so on. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a person who doesn't need to think how special they are. They just have an inner sense of truth. That's a certain inner peace that's there, that is unshakable and unwavering.
It's a pleasure?
Well, tell me what the word pleasure means.
I'm saying it's gratifying, it's hard,
it's the deepest gratifying possible thing, but it's not gratifying how you define pleasure. Pleasure you talk about is from objects. This is not a pleasure from an object. There's nothing here that's giving you pleasure. It's just your Masanic B'atzmusei. I mean, you can only relate it if you have an atzmistic experience. There's no example, because if you have pleasure from a piece of food, or you have pleasure if someone honored you, or you have pleasure because you made $1 million, we're not talking about that at all. That is it's not even the timing what Chassidus talks about. It's
almost the opposite of what.
Do you ever see children play?
I think it is.
You ever see young children play, very young? They play. There's a certain purity about them. They're not even aware of themselves, which is why we're so attracted, because there's nothing jaded about them. A child can be completely satisfied with a little thing and just sits there content. What's going on in this child's consciousness? If you ask the child,
He goes to the most self-conscious person in the world.
Right. What does jaded mean? How do you translate jaded? Jaded means, contaminated by the life's experiences. You get soiled. Abyssal nein. A beggar that's been worn too many times. Life affects the jaded beings. You become cynical, skeptical. Conscious. A child is not conscious. That's a very good word. But that's a very good. A child is not conscious of himself. So imagine when you have enjoying something that you're not conscious of. It's not that common, right?
How do you reach that level? Not to become conscious of himself.
As I said before, the first step is you have to get rid of the things that make you conscious. And the things that make us conscious are because we have been trained, especially in our impressionable years, to please others. So you're really asking the question, how do you build self-confidence? How do you build self-confidence? So it's true, it's harder to do at middle age than it is at young age. Self-confidence is built by being around people that reinforce and believe in you, and by the experience of seeing you can do it. So when a young child starts exploring, imagine a baby starting to crawl around, and the father and mother say, "Don't crawl around," and they force the child to sit in a corner. The first destruction of the child's etzem. Not destruction, but concealment, obviously. Because basically you're telling the child wants to, and will explore and so on, and you're saying to the child, no, you can't do that. Now one time is nothing, but if it's repeated, what happens is the child begins to develop a whole new set of tools that are completely not reflective of itself, and you have the undermining of what we call malchus. The malchus of the child, the etzem of the child has been compromised. Obviously, overt abuse is far even deeper than that. What I just said is you can call passive abuse. But overt abuse, with real abuse, that we're not even getting there.
I think it happens automatically. I think when the kid is crying because he's hungry, already he's not there.
Why?
As soon as he's born, he's not there. He's hungry. He's not. He's conscious.
Why do you have to go on extremes? Are you telling me that, in other words, everybody's dysfunctional because they cry when they're hungry?
Everybody has a certain amount of
okay.
Not complete contentment automatically. Even
Are you secure?
Even when they're first born. That's my point.
Are you secure? Are you secure enough for me to disagree with you?
More than secure.
Okay. So, I don't know where you take your psychology from, but I take it from Chassidus. And Chassidus says that the neshama is divine. If chelik elikam mal mamish is not a source for self-confidence, then it's worthless. What do we need to have a divine? Why do we need to be a piece of God? What does it help us?
But we don't know who's connecting like that.
That's another connecting.
I'm saying a baby is not connected.
How do you know?
He's hungry.
How do you know? How do you know? Which baby did you interview?
How do you know? Okay, you interviewed a 1.5-year-old who played.
I didn't interview. I learned it from Chassidus. I understand Chassidus as a concept of a neshama. All you can talk about is adults that you know. You can't talk about a child. We don't even know a child's psyche. It's impossible. You can't even interview a child if you wanted to. They don't know what to tell you. What is this argument about?
I'm just saying, not so happy as you think all the time.
Where do you get this from? Which child told this to you?
I looked at them.
No.
When they're crying miserably because they're hungry.
They're not crying. God is just giving them an annoying sound to wake you up. That's why they're not crying. They just can't say, please give me food. So God has to make, because if not, they wouldn't cry. You would not wake up in the middle of your night to feed them. That's why. So it makes it annoying. Anyway, I don't look.
The gas pains of a baby. I mean, come on.
Look. I am telling you, I have sources from Chassidus. What is your sources?
I don't see the sources of
Chassidus. So it's a right.
Where are your sources?
It's a legitimate question for me to show you my. One second. It's a legitimate question for me to show you where should be the sources.
Okay.
But that's not the scope of this conversation.
Oh,
okay. Now, but then, just as you dish it out, what are your sources? Your own common sense?
Observation, yeah.
Okay, observation is meaningless.
Okay.
You're going to tell me observation of a child tells you what a child is like? What's that? I have to ask you something. You say you love Chassidus so much, you changed your life and became a frum Jew, and you're telling me observation is what defines reality for you? Observation, you're telling me you look at a child and you know what a child is like? The Torah says a child hevel shein beichet. The Torah says that Mashiach is coming, and you're ready to build the Beis Hamikdash. You don't stop a child from learning Torah because Al Tigu b'Mashiach. Look at the Rebbe's sichos about children, and I'll tell you, you'll have a whole new take on children. Your description of children is taken from my point of view, is the Quaker view, which says that children are born evil, and you got to beat them up. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I don't know where you're getting what you're saying. There's a Torah. The Torah says the Torah says that anyway. I could show you.
I'm just talking about Heinig, etzem Heinig that they're experiencing all the time.
I don't know what you're saying. Okay, listen.
That's what you say. I think that's what you said.
What observation? What do you know about children? I think we know nothing about children. It's a complete mystery. Children are a complete mystery. What do we know what's going on in a child's mind, especially in the early years where they can't even speak, and even later? I'm trying to say to you is that a child is the closest thing to the way we were created before we became distorted. So if you want to know you want to have the anyway. I don't know what this is based. Your observation. I'm telling you. I'm sorry. Listen, I'm very confident to say that your observations versus what says in Chassidus. You can imagine which one I'm going to lean towards.
No concept of what it says.
Anyway, I'm going back to what I said, and I'll say it again. I'm trying to give an example of a contentment, of an inner contentment that one is not conscious of. It's not totally bedover, and it's just at peace with yourself, and there's a certain inner tainug. I think the word tainug is completely distorted by people. We think tainug means pleasure, and that's to identify pleasure. People tell you pleasure is sexual pleasure, there's carnal pleasure, food, there's covet, there's money, there's successes. Tell me what most people will identify pleasure with. Yeah, learning Chassidus, your mind is excited, you get pleasure. Chassidus, the word tainug, this tainug that he's talking about, he's not talking about pleasure like that. That's not pleasure. That's what we call pleasure. This is almost an unconscious state that you are at peace with. It's not even an expression. It's an inner sense of belonging, I would say. That's probably the best word I could find, belonging. And you have it at moments. That's why I gave the moment of a simcha, maybe sometimes a nigun, a farbrengen, a moment of truth. What's a moment of truth? That you're suddenly a pleasure, you can equate that with pleasure of making money. A moment of truth is exactly the opposite. It's nothing about your acquiring. It's about just recognizing the truth of something, and you're blessed to be part of it. It's very much like we spoke about learning. That's why I said, like meichen. What's real meichen? You're so immersed you're not even aware of it. That's even meichen. So tainug is even on a deeper level. Tainug is basically an unconscious state, really, that you just allow to affect you. It's like you let everything go, and I'm just there, and I'm peace with it. I mean, I can elaborate different examples of it, but you can find examples in your life. There's no question about it. When I say children, because children are not conscious of themselves. A child, just has a certain inner experience. Children pick up everything from their parents. Anything screwed up is coming from the parents. Everything healthy comes from God. Simple as that. So taka 3 shutvim. And the one shutv gives the health, and the other 2 mess it up more or less.
Adam before they also weren't conscious of themselves.
Exactly, that's why they didn't need to cover themselves. Sexuality, what sexuality is only a problem when you're conscious. It's not a problem when you're not conscious of it. If you're not conscious of it, it's just part of what you are. It's because the consciousness of it. What is it? What's in it for me? What's not in it? Feel it, I don't feel it. As I said, as soon as you have a feeling something, as soon as you have object and subject, you have duality. Elokus is no object and subject. Object and subject means there's me, and there's the right, exactly. The subject is the person, and the object is what they want. It's a duality. So that's what he says is tainuk. As I said, he elaborates a bit more in chapter 1. I've written up about it. In Samach Vav, there's a long discussion, which is higher, Ratzon and Tainug. It's a few Mamorim about it.
Almost seems like opposite states.
And he brings their contradictions, that sometimes it seems that Ratzon is more powerful, sometimes it seems Tainug. And the conclusion is Tainug is ultimately. But I remember learning it. I think the word Ratzon and Tainug is fundamentally misinterpreted from the first time you learn Chassidus. It always says will and pleasure.
So what's
and will and pleasure is really, I think, completely not what it is. And I think the English words have to be defined. If they're both, first of all, remember they're both makifim. Makifim right away means they're not conscious faculties. The mind is a conscious faculty. Desire and Ratzon and Tainug are unconscious faculties. However, they impact your life. Like you go. Can you go into the engine room of Ratzon, where Ratzon begins? Almost impossible. You can't even identify it. You can identify once you want it. But like we speak to all the levels, the Lifnei HaRatzon, or the Ratzon HaNelam, or the Ratzon HaMuchlet, or these are all states that are processing before you're aware of them. Tainug is the same thing. We're not talking about Tainug like Ava. When you have pleasure, you're attracted to a piece of food and you like it. That's Ava. Ava's moment, Ava's covered, whatever it may be. How's that different than Tainug? So most people say, I remember when I asked this question, my mashpil years ago, he said to me that Ava is the love for it, and Tainug is the pleasure, the tetzah from it, the result. So I went back to him, I said, 1 second, but Tainug is the primis HaKeser, and Ava is in Chesed and Atzilus. So exactly, you're telling me first it starts Chesed, Atzilus, then you get to Tainug. And it became obvious, what are you talking about? That's not Tainug. That's the result, when you have pleasure from something you liked, that's not Tainug in Chassidus. Tainug starts the other way around. You have some type of desire, some type of inner contentment. Let's call it even inner pleasure. What is that even? What is that inner pleasure? Is it a pleasure, let's say, just to be one with God, let's say? So we say a Jew, nishta vil, because that's Ratzon actually. Now he wants and he can be disconnected. So it's an atzmizdika thing, Tainug and Ratzon. It begins from there. It's not the pleasures we are consciously experiencing. So I remember I wrote up a whole thing about it. I don't remember all the details, but I wrote a lot of it. So it really comes down to understanding 2 unconscious faculties that are very all-encompassing. That's really what Ratzon and Tainug. These are 2 primal forces in the soul. One is, its position is more like it is what it is, and Ratzon is the communicator. So basically, Ratzon is the tool that Tainug uses to fulfill its innermost, whatever you can call desire. That's really, because it's an atzmi. Tainug is an atzmi. Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu. God's a desired. We're not talking about a desire. We're talking about the etzem is expressed in what's called a desire, and that will turn into a Ratzon. So he's really talking about the inner processes that really make. The reason it's so complicated is because we're so consumed by conscious faculties and what we like and we don't like, that our meanings of will and desire and pleasure are all about essentially gashmistic things. We're not talking about the soul's desire. You know, when we say, someone says, "What's the soul's real desire?" The soul's real desire is nothing that we do. The soul's desire is to be one with God. Explain that to somebody. What does that mean? That's the deepest tainug of a soul. Because that's the deepest nature of the soul. It wants to be connected to its maker. It's a foreign concept for us. So then we use the word tainug, it becomes very confusing. That's why I'm saying you need to really step back. What's relevant here is that he's doing it's very beautiful here. Remember we spoke about the interface, that the meichin, the mind, is the interface between existence and the divine. It helps you go to a place that's beyond yourself. So he's just saying that this same thing is on a higher level. It's Ratzon and tainug. It's a parenthesis. But it's very critical because it's in the scheme of Ayin Beis. This is what he's been talking about. He's been talking about how do you get from an etzem into a velt. So on the lower level it's Meichen and Midas. On the higher level it's Tainug and Ratzon. You could say that Tainug is probably Erein Sof. That's what you can say. That Tainug, Ratzon is already in Erein Sof. Maybe the level of all of it's saying the Kedem Shalisat, Sfira saying Ketz, or whatever it may be. And Tainug is maybe the field of energy. Maybe. Could be even deeper because it's Nesava. I'm not sure. Okay. Good.
That's the same Ashpeh they use the ketchup out to show you what Shefa is?
That was a different one. I didn't have... Those must be... That's right. I see you remember. Yeah, he tried to explain the difference between Eid and Shefa. So Shefa was a ketchup bottle. And the Shefa comes out, it's like... That was Shefa.
What was Or?
Orange juice. I don't remember. I lost him. He lost me after the ketchup example. I know what he was trying to say. It was obvious what he was trying to say. He was trying to show an example. The problem is, it may be a good example for the word shefa being an actual transmission of an item, whereas air, there's no substance. But it doesn't help us understand Chassidus better. it's like, good, someone give a mushal for the word shefa. So now what? How does that help me? I'm trying to understand shefa beruchnius, and you're telling me... Look, when examples are given, the Rebbe would say this about gematrias. The Rebbe said, gematria is not sam stellen avant mit avant. Gematria, somebody says, okay, a table is gematria this, and a chair is gematria this, that means they're connected. The Rebbe said they're connected, and that's why their gematria fits. When someone gives a mashal, you want to know someone who understands the nimshal, and then he's giving you a mashal. Not that the mashal is just, he came up with a nice idea. It has to be consistent with the spirit of the idea, that the discussion. To me, all this is really the steps of the interface. So Ratzon Tainug, good. Okay, I would say, based on this Yesh Leimer, actually, I have a new thought I never thought of before. It doesn't come so often, so it's a big chiddush.
Where's the rush?
No. I think what he's saying here, because he's saying with this Yesh Leimer, the interesting Yesh Leimer, that because remember he's stripping Meichen and Midas from the word Meichen and Midas. It's Etzem and Gilui on a lower level. It means intellect. That's why intellect is introverted, and emotions are extroverted. So he's saying it's like the root of Meichen is in Tainug, and the root of Midas is in Ratzon, which stems because it says Zo ba'arich ochid v'talya. Midas is in arich, which is Ratzon, and Pnimis Abba, Pnimis Atik. That's my epiphany here. It probably does say somewhere. I don't think it's a chiddush, actually, now that I think of it. But it's an interesting way of putting it. In other words, in our unconscious, where does Moichin begin, and what's Moichin and Midas on the unconscious level? On the conscious, it's intellect, cognitive, and emotional. In the unconscious, it's what we call Tainug and Nutzen. I like that. That's very good. Because really, we're not talking about, you see, the intellectual process, when a person is sitting and contemplating, like he's speaking here, the mind working, according to the way he's explaining it here, is really your ability to be conscious and to, not the word conscious, not the word, your ability to travel to an inner place. That's really what the mind is able to do. An animal doesn't have that capacity. An animal can't contemplate. An animal's mind, as we said, could be shrewd, brilliant, all about hunting, survival, protecting, breeding, blah, blah. The fact that we have an ability to abstract from our needs means that our mind can take us to a place that is beyond survival, beyond just biological or survival. That means the mind fundamentally is a tool to travel into the etzem. That's what it really means. As opposed, midas on the other hand are going the other direction. The mind is taking you in, and midas are taking you out. They're taking you to have a relationship with something or with someone. We're not talking now which is better or not. They're both needed, but it's a very different experience. So Tainug and Ratzon unconsciously is the same thing. Tainug is the experience of the etzem, an atzmistic experience, and Ratzon is the relationship with something. I think that's how I would really define this. Now, how this manifests in our lives, there are times, I said, what means an atzmistic experience? Listen, some people were by Fabrengen. I saw people by Fabrengen would tell me afterwards, this was like, people were transformed, at least for the moment, of a moment of truth. Even if it didn't matter what the Rebbe said and what they heard. There are people who just, in the presence of that environment, was truth. All day you're busy with all kinds of Baba Mises, and it was a moment of truth. That is an atzmistic experience. Simple as that. Can you quantify it? I don't know if everybody has their own poetic words of describing. Sometimes it's not describable, really. I'm positive everybody here has experiences like this. How often is another question. Whether you can generate it is even the bigger question. That it happens to us, yeah, of course, there are moments things just happen. But to generate it, obviously, there's no question you can generate it because you have it in you. If it happened to you, it means that you're capable of it. Today many people say, okay, so how do you recreate the experience of the Rebbe, or Fabrengen, or by Tchir Shefer, or Yom Kippur, or Sukkot, or Simchas Torah, etc., etc.? The answer is, of course, it's far easier. The Rebbe spoiled us. He just did it, and then he lifted everybody up on his wings, and that was that. Today you don't have that in quite that manner. So you have to dig deeper, and recreate it. Whether it's not necessarily through memory, a memory that can be recreated today and live, but it means it's harder work. You have to reach into. Can you give somebody an atzmistic experience? That's the question. And frankly, as Chassidim and so on, if we answer to that we can't, then we're missing the whole boat. Frankly, that's what we were here for. Now, the fact is, everybody on earth has the ability, but when you're taught it and you learn it, you're supposed to be able to give people an atzmistic experience. Now, of course, you could ask me, how do you define atzmistic experience? Well, I'm just trying to find resonating examples that touch us. Things that are moments of truth. As I said, that's a sense of belonging. Some people have it. They go to the Grand Canyon, they stand in front of Niagara Falls, and other wonders, and they have it. You could have it. You suddenly sense something that is awesome. It doesn't have to be always through a thing of Gedusha. You could sense it. You sense something that's beyond you. You sense something that is true. The problem is we go back to a corrupt world, and we have to deal with a whole bunch of stuff that becomes the real dominating force in our lives. God didn't create the need for money and survival. We could be spending all our time in moments of truth. But it doesn't go that way. That was the last thing that Alter Rebbe wrote. Nefesh HaShvela. Before he passed away, he wrote, that's a world of sheker. And the chiddush is that you have to find in the world of sheker, you have to find emes. That was the last thing he said before he went to Elam Emes. So he gave us the last message about Almad Shikra. Yeah. Find that pretty amazing. So he says there, the world was created, the Abish to ask Emes, should I create the world? And Emes said no, because Elam is Molish Karim. It's a world full of lies, so how could he ask Emes? Emes is not going to tell you create a world of lies. You asked Chesed. Chesed said it's also a world Molech Sodim. In Tavshir Chav Gimel, 150 years ago, when the Rebbe celebrated the 150th Shnas HaKan of the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe said, gewaldige expression. The Rebbe says a gewaldige Ishprach. That the world is Molech Sodim and Molech Shkorim. Interesting, right? It's full of chesed and full of lies. And the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that the chiddush is that in the world of sheker we have to bring emes. And also you see Chassidim, the Gershom Bepahar, the last day of his life, they asked him what does he look forward to. He says, I finally won't be lying. That was his last. I'm looking forward to finally not lying, not sheker. Paharer, Gershom Bepahar. Actually, my grandfather, my great grandfather, he was a big chassid at Tzemach Tzedek. You never heard Gershom Ber Paharer?
So I heard of him, but not.
There's a whole Pahar. Pahar is a city. Paharer means from Pahar, like Hillel Paritch. Paritch is a city. When you say you add er after a city, it becomes the one from Paritch.
I understand.
So Pahar. Where's Pahar? Where is Lubavitch? What do you mean? Where's Pahar? It's on the map. It's a city. Yes, you sound like every other city. The only one missing is Pahar.
Is it Ukraine? Is it?
It's somewhere. I don't know. I never really looked it up, to be honest. It's some town. You know how many towns there are?
Smolensk.
My father was a geography whiz. He knew every city and every river in the world. And trust me, there's a lot of rivers, and they're all Russian. The Russians have a lot of rivers. There's more rivers in Russia than anywhere in the world. So we used to have this game we played, like we took long trips on the car. So you're bored, so we had this game, like, you start with, let's say, you say New York. So if someone says the K, you have to say Kentucky. You have to take the last letter and make the next. So forget about playing with my father, because he had Kremenchuk and Krementupi, everything. And the hard ones are like I, you. But in Russian, you have everything begins with an I or a U, and he had you couldn't play with him. He had I remember, 1,000 rivers in Russia alone. So we said, you know what, no more rivers. Okay, so he found towns. No more towns. Cities. Right? Wie viel Teichen sind da in Russland? No, it's true, but for Russia, there's some reason, I think there's a lot. Well, Russia is a large piece of territory there.
Used to be 1/6 of the world.
The USSR.
But still, Russia is also not bad. From the tip of China to here, it's half the planet.
10 time zones.
10 time zones.
Time zones.
It's like a 12-hour flight.
Well, we have 3 in the United States. 10?
Yeah.
Wow.
Who bets him at 4?
Alaska and Hawaii, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, but those are shtickle. But okay, fine.
Those really belong to Russia.
Alaska, yeah. They sold it.
Any of you ever did research on this thing with the what are they called, transcontinents? How the continents were all once one,
Sure.
like South America fits into Africa, all that. Yeah. It's not against the Torah thinking. You could say it's absolutely acceptable,
That's one of the
which
things.
would explain how human beings migrated. Okay, let's go on here. Not related. Now after the principle, now he goes back, and that's why the mechin also, when they are to yourself, they're not in the form of hispashtus. Their personality is not an expansive one, not in a hispashtus as spreading out, and in a descending, a state of descent. Adrabah b'chinas aliyah dafke. Mechin is aliyah, like I said, it's going inward. The idea when someone's concentrating on something, it's an inward experience. So when someone's really involved, the more inward they go. They're going in. As I said, they're going into the etzem. And etzem is built in mispashit.
That digging deeper to get into the core.
Right. As it's known, every ilah v'ol, every cause and effect, hagimul d'shein sheba'ol, which is Chabad. In every cause and effect, the 3 higher levels of the cause, of the effect. Heim b'chinas dveikus by ilah shalamayla mena. Okay, so here we got to explain what this means. Chabad the spheres and the midas and the 10 spheres are always used as examples of gradation, of hierarchy. So think of, let's say, Chochmah Bina Das as being superior. The superiors, the authorities, and their subordinates are Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. So when you talk about Ilah V'Olol, you're saying, okay, it begins with the Meichin, let's say, are the planners in a company. The Midas are the implementers. So it's not the implementers telling the planners what to do. The planners tell the implementers. So who's the cause? The cause is the plan, the mind. And then you say, here's how you implement it. Or here's how you react, if you wish, to the point of implementation. The question is, what's the relationship between this cause and effect? So Chassidus explains, like he says, Neida, that the intellect in the emotions, meaning the people who are subordinates, also have a mind. And they listen to and they're connecting to the Chabad. So the Gimel Rishenis of the effect, meaning the highest level of the effect, is connected to the lowest level of the cause. You follow what I just said? So let's say you have in a team there's a hierarchy. So the superior comes and says, this is the plan. And he explains it to the head of the team of the implementers, who also has a mind.
The head of the
The
department.
owner, the manager.
Right. He's the head of the lower department, but his Gimel Rishenis, you also need their mind. You need someone who's the team leader. That team leader. So the people who are the actual bricklayers, meaning not the Gimel Rishenis, the Zayin Tachtonis, the lower level of the effect, they may not be connecting directly. So there's in other words, Ilah V'Olol is not just cause and effect, but the higher elements of the effect are connecting to the lower elements of the cause, so to speak. That's what he's saying here, which is just proving that Meichin, in other words, is Teva Aliyah. Meichin is responding to or receiving from something beyond it. So that's what he says. What is that? And that is that he comprehends and understands his cause. And that's the dveikus, the attachment and iskashus and connection with the cause. I gave the example like I just said. I think it's a good example when you have it like that. So if, for example, there was a team and there was no one there that understood what the planner said, they may implement, but it's going to be very dumb. This way there's a relationship, because somebody understood it on a lower level, and then or like a Talmud and a teacher. So the teacher has a brilliant mind. He's now expressing the idea. The Talmud's Gimel Rishenis are connecting to the teacher's expression, to the teacher's actual Zayin Tachtenis, actually, to be more. The teacher's lower level of expression is what this Talmud is connecting to with his mind. So that's the process. As I said here, we're talking here the process of how things evolve. Zayin Tachtenis are Gimel Rishenis is the 3 firsts and the 7 lower. I'm not talking about this. I'm saying that sometimes the expression is the 3 first ones and the 7 lower ones. Not so much talking about here.
7 lower ones.
That's when it's 7 lower spheres of the 10. Okay. But derech klal etzemin hameichin hu sheim b'chinas havdola legamri ma'adover v'nivdol memenu. He's giving here a real full analysis of meichin. That's what he's really doing here. So b'chlal, but derech klal is now going further. The core nature, the core etzemin of meichin is what? Is in a form of separation, detachment, aloofness, legamri ma'adover hanivdol memenu. What does that mean?
Can it mean that the Gimulation is talking about the Gimulation of the Midas?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, okay, it doesn't mean that.
Gimel Rishen is Chabad, always Chabad, or Kesach Chochmah Bina. So he's saying the Gimel Rishen is of an effect. Let's say Gimel Rishen of the Midas connect to the Ilah, to the Meichin. What's the problem? And everything is that way. The highest 3 levels of whatever the effect is connected.
The Midas. So the highest 3 levels of the Midas, right?
Or whatever the effect is. I said Midas.
Right,
Yeah. The point he's trying to make is that Meichin's Teva is Aliyah. Meichin is what is listening to, is receiving from. Now he says, okay, Etzamin HaMechen is the Ayin of Havdalah L'Gam HaDover HaNivdal Memenu. I guess he's talking about the thing when you're concentrating on an idea, you're not focusing on the subject, but you're focusing on.
I think it's not Ilavalo, that Meichen is not Ilavalo.
No, he's moving to another subject now. He's just speaking, he's forget about Ilval now. That was just an example. Now he's talking B'derech Klal. He's going back. Meichen is, all he's want to say is Meichen is, we keep going, that Meichen, as opposed to Midas, is not, Midas is an extension, and Meichen is Etzem. That's what he's speaking about. Because he's coming to explain here the two things in Midas Shebesechel. Anyway,
Meichen is like pulling away.
so now he's saying Etzamin HaMeichen Inin Shem B'chinas Havdalah Gam HaDover HaNivdal Memenu. I'm not sure what he means HaDover HaNivdal Memenu. Instead he means, okay, let me explain. Yeah, let's read on. Meichen basically means that they're separate. It's just continuing the theme that he's elaborating here, and that the intelligence, mind, is inward. Midas now is not. We're not talking about excitement. We're talking Midas as nitiyah, inclination. That's where he's going here. Okay, so.
And now do we mean Chabad, or is it?
Chabad is Meichen. What's the question?
Meichen is like, it's not like a filter to me. Like,
what do you mean? Meichen consists of Chachma, Bina, and Das.
that's all it is. That's what they mean.
Okay, so he says like this. So Kamei Teva Meichen, the Gadlus, like mature intelligence, the nature of mature intelligence, Liyas B'chinas Havdalah. So mature, Meichen the Gadlus, a person who's a developed intellect, its personality, its nature, is being removed from something, detached, aloof. Those words work. Now he doesn't really. Dover hanivdal memenu. Shem b'chinas Havdalah l'gamri. It seems to me that he means to say that when let's say you're trying to understand the nature of a fire. So the intellect of it is not a relationship with fire. You're moving away from the fire. You're just understanding it. So you're going into the so-called the soul of it and its properties, as opposed to the object itself. That's what I think he's saying. But regardless, the idea is clear. Meichen is Havdalah. Now, Midas on the other hand, the Midas within Meichen, as we said, there's two things in those Midas within Meichen. The first one he spoke was Hispilus Sichli, a certain subtle excitement in the idea itself. And now he's speaking about how it's an inclination. So he says, Midas b'Meichen, hey natiyas v'amshachas ha'Meichen, liz b'chinas yirida uv'amshach. The Midas within Meichen, not Meichen, pure, undiluted intelligence, but the emotions within the Meichen, they draw down. Hey natiyas, they're like an inclined hamshachas, a drawing down of the intelligence, that it should have some. It should extend itself. Ukamoi seichel hamata klape chesed klape din. Like we say, a seichel, an intelligence that leans toward chesed, like Hillel, more lenient, kindness, or klape din, or more severe, more stringent. Shezeu hatiyas haseichel. We're not talking here midas. We're not talking about what we saw earlier, that your emotions, you're excited or emotional about something or drawn to something. You're talking about an intelligence that's being drawn to a particular conclusion, or a particular emotional, I won't say emotion, to a particular feature, emotional feature. So chesed or din, for example. Because intelligence now, so he's breaking down here two things what's going on here. Number one, that seichel on its own does not have any inclinations, and two, that the midas and seichel are still within seichel. They're not midas outside of seichel. So here's how it goes. Seichel itself is just comprehending a subject matter. Fundamentally that. The Ein Amid is the Chesed Gvura in the Karim by Ayin. And you cannot recognize in it any type of inclination to being more lenient or not lenient. Think of it like a judge sitting in a court of law, or a jury, or a researcher. You're researching a subject. You shouldn't be having inclinations at that point. You should be unbiased, absorbing all the information in every possible direction. That's the nature of intellect. If you find out that the judge had a bias, Chesed Gvura bias, he should recuse himself. Because you want to have what is a pure intellectual process? An unbiased, you get the idea, on everything, right? A process of trying to understand something. And then you come to a conclusion, which is the Midas Shebemech. He doesn't say they're not there. They're not nikar boy. Obviously, when he's going to come to a conclusion and say potter or chayiv or kosher apostle or it says chesed gvura, you have to say that it was in the intellect earlier also, as we learned with Shmaya Vavtayan, and we'll talk about that soon on Shammai and Hillel. But the process itself of discovery of study and research, you don't see any chesed and gvura yet, and you're not going to find it, even if you look for hints. Because the person is a true intellect, he's not going to be leaning in one direction. He's going to be really listening to every possible approach. So besides that, it's not nikah. You also don't know. Even if you were see that there's, even if you saw in some of the thought process something chesed and gvura, you don't know which way it's going to go, which way it's going to conclude. So he's saying now the midas, when you're saying now that the intellect is already inclining toward, that's already a lower level. They're yedidus haseichel. They're drawing the mind now into a particular direction. That it should result the hatiyah leaning on inclination, l'chesed, lenient, or the din, stringent. Ve'ein ze adayin hatam shel hamidah. He continues on. Now, this is not the reason for the midah. So this is not an intellect like we learned before with the psak din halacha that says kosher, apostle, right, or mutter, osir. There you're talking absolute expression of a particular midah, chesed gvura. But you also give a tam and say the reason for it is so and so. As we said earlier, and the real reasons, the developed, the pilpul and all the length is concealed. Now it's the other way around. In the mind is the other way around. It's the pilpul that matters. It's the concept that matters. It's the ideas, and the midah, the conclusion, is concealed. See how it's mamish like. In other words, midas, the lowest level of Yaakov, compared to Yisrael Saba, is like exactly turned around. There, the negay is the halacha, this way or that way, and you give a little reason to explain it, to justify it. Here, the opposite. We're not talking about the reason for the midah, like he said before, that there's a certain midah you want so and so, and then you give a reason to justify it, to explain it. Here's the opposite. It's not that tam shal midah kizel be'etzem haseichel adayin, because now you're in the state of core intelligence. You're not talking about a particular inclination this way or that way. That's what we learned earlier, is the level of Yaakov. We only have the bechein, you have the conclusion, like he says here, that the real comprehension of the whole subject matter is concealed. All you're getting is the final conclusion, and you have the reason. The only thing you left now is the psak that says this is permitted, this is not permitted, and bekitzer, a summary of the reason behind it, like we learned in the previous chapter. Aval kan, here the opposite. Here we're talking where they're still in the process of the whole research and discovery and contemplation. I'm sorry. That means the comprehension of the Ayin. When it's in the throes, in the intensity of comprehension, What is he saying? That while you're in the intensity of the contemplation, you come to a midah. So even if you come to a midah, the main driving force is not the inclination; it's not mevalbal. It's not confused. In other words, I'm saying like this. So in other words, while you're contemplating, and while you're contemplating, and part of your contemplation says lean something toward chesed, it's not the chesed of the conclusion, which is a tangible and defined midah that has a reason within it. Here you're talking; it's all part of the process of intellect. That some of it sometimes goes chesed, sometimes gvura, but that's all part of intellectual process. It's not mevalbal. Just because, let's say, you suddenly come to something while you're studying that leans a little toward chesed, doesn't mean you suddenly become chesed. Part of the process is you're exploring every possible inclination. Right. That's what he's saying. And it's not mevalbal. That's the proof. Because if it was mevalbal, it would be a problem. If it would confuse you and say, oh, you know what? It suddenly biases you and distorts, then you're no longer intellect. You've gone into the world of emotions.
Are you talking like in this called chesed sheba bina or bina sheba chesed type thing? Which do you put first?
I'm not sure what your question is.
It's a mathematical question.
It's not a mathematical. It's how do you express it? Because we know that all the intellectual faculties has actually bina. I don't remember whether it's bina sheba chesed or chesed sheba bina when you express it, what's going on.
Bina sheba chesed or chesed sheba bina?
Yeah, for example.
We're not talking about either of them now. We're talking about moichin without a midas.
But when it sees a midas.
So there's midas sheba meichin. He calls it midas sheba meichin. The emotions within the amount. Yeah.
So this is like.
So this midas b'mechin that the Rebbe is expressing here, these are just pure midas in the idea that you be maskil.
Pure the other way around. It's pure intellect that includes all kinds of inclinations that are chesed, gvura, and so on.
Without a hataya to one thing or the other.
Right. Without.
That's what I meant by pure. I mean,
yeah.
It's devoid of.
But that's the.
Like we said.
That's the Yerida Sheba Seichel?
That's what he says. The midas create a Yerida. Because Seichel on its own is pure contemplation. As soon as you get into the midas of it.
Even if it's not actualized.
It's the conclusion, he says. He says, once you finish the process of intellect, you'll ultimately come to a conclusion and a resolution. Is it chesed or gvura? But we're not there yet. It's the process.
So the Rebbe says, Baal Amida, is this happening in Seichel, or this is after this whole thing?
I think this is more that while contemplating, you come to one argument that is very chesedic, and then you come to an argument that's very gvuridic. So this mid is part of the intellectual process. It's not part of an emotional experience.
And therefore it's not available because it's just in pure Seichel.
Correct. Ayin, as we see, because now as we see that during a person's comprehension of a subject, he's higher than, he's transcendent, he's above any emotion that comes out of it. If at the same time he leans toward his iskarav, he becomes too close to a particular sensation or feeling, that comes from this contemplation has him available. This will confuse him. It will confuse him in the comprehension. And the comprehension will become concealed because he will suddenly it's like having an emotional reaction while you're in the middle of research, while you're in the middle of discovery, while you're in the middle of really hearing or trying to understand the whole subject matter. Which is exactly going back. This is being someone who's not absorbing the idea because they're already bringing their own personal inclinations into the picture. Which means you're not really going to get the idea and you're going to get confused, for sure. So now, as I said, there's two aspects here going on. There's intellect, pure, unadulterated intellect, which is devoid of any inclinations. But even the midas that don't come from it are still midas that come from meichen. They're not midas that come from emotions. which is critical, because before we were talking how we mature emotionally from a childish perspective, immature perspective, to a more mature perspective. So you need moichin that trains you to understand what God is and so on. But it's ultimately the training of midas. Here we're talking about how the mind, in its objective analysis, comes to a conclusion that has an emotional inclination. So he says here, now so he continues. So though Meichin itself is beyond Midas, but the Midas that come from Meichin, Midas Elu Kreich HaTiras HaMeichin El HaMidas. This is the power of Kreich HaTiras HaMeichin. Is the power of the inclination of the mind toward the Midas. It's not controlled by Midas. When a person objectively, and was not movable, was not confused by feelings, objectively heard all the information, and you know he's objective, and then comes and says, you're right and you're wrong, or kosher, puzzle, whatever it may be, then it's has nothing to do. Then there's of course that's the way the healthy process is supposed to work. So it's Meichin gave birth to Midah here, not Midah affected the Meichin to. So it's a very different level, Midah Sheba Meichin and Meichin Sheba Midas. But obviously they will speak to each other. They will speak to each other because Midah Sheba Meichin can then speak to Meichin Sheba Midas as well. It's not a contradiction, but he hasn't gone there yet. This is like really the dynamics, the anatomy of an objective perspective. How do you achieve objectivity? This is what you want to have. In Inyan Hamidus Elokechet She'ein Hamidus Mavalbim Kala Hamech. Because the Midas are not Mavalbim. They're not. If they were Mavalbim, then the Midas are a personality that are getting involved here. But the Midas are not confusing at all the intelligence, the idea. It's very strong. It means even when he's leaning toward inclining toward these Midas, it's still what dominates is the Tekefer HaMeichin. It's not because the Midah, because he likes it or doesn't like it, or because he's going to benefit from it or not. It's that the mind is leading me there. The objective mind is leading me toward this particular Midah. Shemeir Esloi Begili Mamish. Right. The intensity of the intelligence that's illuminating, radiating with him, Mamish, literally revealed. And the parentheses of now he qualifies it in return. That is definitely, it's not as complete and perfect as it is in the pure contemplation. Once it's already being inclined toward a particular midah, it's true, it's still meichin, but it's already yerid of meichin, because we said the nature of meichin is to go inward, is to stay beyond any inclinations.
But there must
And nevertheless, in these midas radiates from the etzem Ayin, the light, the energy of the intellect in the etzem Ayin.
So there are two levels of midas in Meichin, one before the Hatayim and one after the Hatayim.
Well, before it's not midas. It's just meichin be'etzem, period. That's just meichin. Obviously, there's stages how the midas evolve, but generally it goes like this. When you're immersed in a meichin, as he said at length here, meichin by nature is an aliyah, is havdalah. It doesn't have inclinations altogether. It's trying to understand something. It's cold, detached, objective mind. Think of a computer. It's never going to reach a midah. It may give you and say, based on all the data you put in, here's what I think is the conclusion. But it's not human. Fine. We're human beings. So now the mind, in its purest form, is doing all this analysis and is detached. As I said, as a matter of fact, there are many people who don't want to become judges and don't want to become rabbanim because they like the pilpul. They don't want to get into conclusions. They want to stay in the world of intellect. They want to keep it. They can go either way. This way, that way. Because intellect is actually much more at home with that type of approach. That there's always nuances, and I don't want to come to a conclusion. Maybe this way, and it's not perfect this way. Real pure mind, as he said, is really the teva aliyah. It's going into the etzem. But because we live in this world, and also God wants us to act, there needs to come to some conclusions. You can't just be pilpul, stay on the fence. So then what happens is, so then comes a point where the midas Sheba start coming into play, or I would say that Mechin begins to, I would say as you finish the research and you're coming to a conclusion, the Mechin in its full intensity probably begins to recede a little and gives way now to the inclinations that it led to, but it's directed and guided and informed by the intellect, objective intellect, not by any emotions. And that's when the midas Sheba Mechin come fully. Then you say kosher, apostle, etc. That's how I would say. So obviously there's stages. It's like you could say before you actually write the ruling, the night before you're probably leaning already to the ruling, but you're still weighing both ways. So obviously you can identify a whole bunch of stages how the mind is still in its objectivity and still sees both equally, and then starts leaning one way, and then it challenges it. I mean, if you do it right, and then it finally comes to a conclusion.
That night is that Zutta, that's what shows Zutta already. When you're contemplating, you go down to Yisrael Zach, and then
this is all Yisrael Sabbath. This is not Yisrael Zutta.
But Zutta, when the night before,
no, Zutta is the conclusion.
Zutta is the other way. Zutta is when the emotions are. We're talking the world. This is the world of intellect, not the world of emotions. This is just how mind comes to emotions. Look, we're talking about the switches. We're talking about how mind meets heart here, how the intellect meets emotions. That's what we're discussing here. And cognitive meets feelings. 1 second. So now. Ubavade goes back, it's still not like in the Hasag itself, it was completely undiluted by any inclinations. And nevertheless, even when there is inclinations, it's informed completely by the core energy of the intelligence. So it's intelligence, but now the intelligence has come to a conclusion. How this concept is mechayev chesed, compels us to leniency, oidin, or to stringency. So the mind in its objective research and its objective journey has led now to an emotional conclusion. I don't say the emotional conclusion is not the right way, to a defined, expressed conclusion, which is either chesed or gvura. Remember, expressed. Mind is not expression. Mind is inward. The mind is an analyst, in essence. It's a reflective analyst. That's the mind in its purest form. As soon as you ask the mind to come to inclinations, it's already going outside of its natural comfort zone. But you want a mind like that to be the one that informs the inclinations. You don't want someone that's emotional and biased doing so. Maybe we should hang this up. This should be like the criteria for every Rav. I'm sorry. So now he's going back to remember Yisrael Saba was 2 levels. He said Yisrael Saba of Tfuna. There's the Mechin of Yisrael Saba was Chachma. And Tfuna was right. Yisrael Saba b'chinas midas sheba Chachma. So now he's saying like this. Now he's going. Because now what's the difference between midas and chachma, midas and bina? They're both. The midas and chachma is such that how through the hisamtus hasechel, the resonance, the truthful resonance of the seichel, ba amida lechesed l'din or l'isur v'heter. That after researching something, after studying something, there's a hisamtus. The mind senses intelligently, not intuitively. It senses intelligently. I certainly hisamtus. It senses this is the right. It's like when you study all the evidence and you realize, you come to a realization that's just like a flash of clarity. That's either that it comes to chesed din or Isser Heter. Ukidua bein shasik rav. Shalei motza tam hasagal Isser. Like we have in the story of Shasik Rav, the Rebbe brings this in the Haris and Sich and the Maimorim. So Rav was quiet. he gave a ruling and he was quiet. He didn't have the cause. He could not find a expressible reason and explanation for forbidding it, for the Isser. But he also could not say opposite. He couldn't say mutter. Why? Because the truth of the truth just resonated with him and leaned toward this direction. That's the midas in Chachma. So in other words, it's not so much. It's not. You can't really explain it. It's more just a sense. It's an intellect, but not a sense, an emotional sense. It's a sense of truth that Chachma has. A certain intellectual intuition. Yeah.
So what do you do in Bina after you got that?
One second, he's going on. Now, that from the real understanding, you could explain it. From the understanding of the subject, you came toward an inclination of chesed or din. B'tuv tam b'svaris ha'mechayovis. With a very tuv tam, with a very fine argument and reasoning. B'svaris ha'mechayovis. Arguments that compel you to say that. In other words, not like Shosik Rav that he's silent and just senses it. I can show you. He could, like you see sometimes, you'll see judges write it out. They'll say, "Here's my ruling," and they'll say, "Why? I have this evidence, and this is what I determine," and they'll trace the path of their logical conclusion, how they got to this conclusion. Now, the first one is also seichel. The first one's not he had some type of insight, epiphany from above, or some type of emotional reaction. It's also seichel. It's just a less explanatory type of seichel. It's more of a resonant element. But obviously, you need someone you trust, because you can't just say someone. It has to be a person that you trust. Because judges say, "I just felt that this witness was real and this one was lying. I can't prove it, but I feel it." It's also, juries have been known to know that they say some witnesses were credible and some weren't. Can't always explain it. They could be wrong also, but it's not based on a bias. It's just based on more of a chochmadika nekuda rather than a binadika explanation.
Oh, yeah. In all this,
everyone knew O.J. Simpson was guilty.
Yeah.
But if the glove don't fit, you got to acquit the jingle, like a rap song. That's what happened, right?
You gonna sing it for us?
I don't know if they actually sang it. He just said it. If the glove don't quit, if the glove don't fit, you got to acquit. What a great! It's a classic moment in justice.
They were all right, Brad. They all sung it.
Anyway, he was. But they destroyed his life anyway. He lives in a living hell because in domestic court, right? He was found.
He's in jail.
Now he's in jail.
Oh, in jail for what?
Because he was armed.
Okay, yeah. Well, everyone knew. It was clear that he killed her in every possible way.
But now he's in jail for something else. Totally.
Okay, that's a justice in America. But for what? For speeding?
No, armed. He invaded somebody's hotel room to take what was his.
Overcooking his stuff. With a gun.
He took back what was his with the gun, exactly.
Okay.
It
was just a lesson in Verstehst. We worship football running backs. You ever hear them talk in interviews? Hey, we just, how could you respect this? Like ridiculous. They're sports geniuses, perhaps, but the seichel not too much.
one second. It's getting subtler here. So. Okay,
so fine. So we got this. So this is Bina. So now we have the midas of Chachma. We have hundreds of levels here, my friends. Yeah, two Chachma Bina. Yeah.
Okay, but now we have more.
And understanding.
This is Hecher from midas.
This is Venus.
So it means midas.
No, because now he's going. Remember, there were two things. He said midas and Meichen had two things. Let's not forget where this is going. He began. 1 second. Relax a second. Listen, I'm explaining it here. He said two things. When he started with midas shebe Meichen, he said it's not like Meichen shebe midas. So he said there's two things. One thing is there's actually spilus. There's an excitement when you understand something.
Okay.
Excitement, he said, be'ava, be'ira, lefineses bonus. There's also excitement in the heart, emotion. He said that's a much more subtle one. And there he gave in the parentheses the two ones. You're so immersed, no excitement at all. Or chetenis, and you have a certain excitement. Then he said there's a second meaning in midas, an inclination.
Okay.
So now midas shebeseichel itself, forget about Chachma Bina. There's also two levels. So now he's going back to the first one. 1 second, listen. He said, "V'zehu." What's zehu? Not the tzvei, the eine, the inclination, not the bina, not the chachma. No, he's going back to midas in general. We just finished a long discussion that the midas and seichel is an inclination, not an excitement, not a spilus, but inclination. We'll go back. Let me show you where he said it, so you'll know the context here. Omnam, the 4th line on page 262. Omnam yesh b'chinas midas she'enim b'chinas spilus ki men b'chinas hatiyah v'amshacha. This whole page was about that.
Right.
Now he's coming and saying that the midas that are an inclination are higher than the midas and seichel that are an excitement. He's now making a statement.
Beis is higher than
Right, exactly. Are not relevant. That's all an inclination.
They're parts of the one.
Inclination, hatiyah, not haspilus. Now he's going back. A new paragraph. V'zehu, what's zehu? The inyan of midas shabaseichel that is hatiyah, not hispilus, is higher from the midas and seichel that are hispilus sichli, that are excitement. Let me just explain. Let me go back to very important this. You're learning something, you're learning an inyan in Torah. You're learning a subject. You get excited by the idea. That's midas shabameichel. We're not talking about how that excitement then goes and trains your midah to be more mature. That's the world of midas. That we discussed is Yisrael Zuta,
Right.
as opposed to Yaakov, which is even less than that.
Right.
Now we're talking. The mind has gotten excited. It learned something. It's excited about the idea. That's one thing. Then there's another thing in midas shabameichel, that the mind is leaning and inclined towards something. That's opposite of mind, because meichen be'etzem is havdalah, meichen is aliyah, meichen is atzmi. Midas is haspashtus. So how does a mind get to hispashtus? The answer is because a mind can have to come to a conclusion of a midah, but that's a yerida for the mind. So now we have two types of midas in meichen, just for the record. So he's saying this inclination is obviously far subtler than excitement, because when the mind gets excited about learning something, it's far more tangible, far more emotional. Actually, you can ask a question: how could the mind altogether get excited? The mind is hepecha excitement. So Taka said in the parentheses, if you remember, that true excitement shows you're not really immersed in the subject. So excitement shows more of a chetzenius thing. Not to say you shouldn't have it, but it shows more of an external experience of intelligence. He's saying that is lower than the inclinations that the midas do in the meichen, which gives it more chesed and gvura. In other words, when a judge or an objective person is thinking process, he's not getting excited. He's hearing this chesed, gvura, back and forth, and he says, "You know what? It's kosher. It's chesed." Okay. He may not even get excited about it. He may never even though, I'm sure the intellectual process always has some type of feelings about it. Then there's another thing that you push it, there's midas shabameichen, that meichen gets excited about something. That's what he's saying here. That's all he's saying.
But both these madrigas are in continuous meichen.
Not necessarily, because he said before in the parentheses, excitement in general is not so pneumius. It's chetzenius hameichen.
They still call Yisrael Saba.
There's all Yisrael Saba, everything here. And Yisrael Saba is Abba ve'ima tatoin, by the way. We didn't even get to the Yichud Chadash, the Chiddush. This is all maintenance.
What about in the
pretty good, right?
Of this chapter? He said about that it's sometimes his spilus sichli is aval ene oimed b'murgash hazeh.
That's what I just said. That's what we're talking about. That's real.
Also lower than these two levels.
When you're not aimed b'murgash b'zeh, you're not excited, so there's no emotions.
But that he's doing in his first practices when he's explaining the.
Yes, it's chesed v'gvura megulim mechusim. You're asking me if the netiyah of chesed and gvura is higher than the mechusim? Probably not. It's higher than the megulim, not than mechusim. Because when you're so immersed in the thing, you're not really excited. It's only concealed in it. So that's more. That seems to be more. Maybe I'm not sure. He doesn't really say that, but it's definitely higher than expressed spilus for sure. V'gam l'mayla. 1 second, maybe he's going to say it here. V'gam l'mayla meizbonas v'asoga lekisha lehelid ha'spilus shabalev. I'm sorry, I didn't read right. V'gam l'mayla meizbonas v'asoga lekis Shelahela hispal shabalev. No. How do you read
We
this?
said the line before. We said Zel L'maylam and Chus HaMidrash B'Sechel.
Gam
He says also it's also not only L'maylam and Midrash B'Sechel, but it's also L'maylam as Beis for Zagol L'Kishalayim.
In other words, so it's not only higher than this, but it's also higher than this abundance, than the contemplation and comprehension of the divine that gives birth, that is there in order to give birth to an excitement in the heart. Also, not only gives birth, but also what automatically gets excited from that.
All this.
In other words, from Yisrael Zutta, what he said before. He said before that when you contemplate and expand your consciousness, you get more excited about the divine, but that's all midas. Oh no, my mistake.
Whatever we discussed here.
One second. Fine. And Gam, not only is in other words higher than the midas, it's also higher than the zbanus, what we're saying.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. Higher than the hasaga.
Read after the parentheses.
Shekol zehu ba'seichel hashayich lemidus.
All these levels that are lower, they're shaykh lemidus.
All this is seichel that has a relationship to midas.
And atoy is not shaykh.
Aval midas elu shem b'chinas hatiyah ein b'hem shun spilus haklal. This is all because it's all seichel shayich lemidus. So that's why you're getting excited.
Yeah.
I would say the parentheses is not going in that category because that's not seichel shayich lemidus. Because you're experiencing so deeply you don't feel anything. It's probably in the higher level. Right. Very good. But midas, as it's an inclination, as I just said with the judge or so on, there's no spilus at all. There's no excitement. It's just a matter of a very sober and what we'll call it. It's cool, right? Exactly, calculation that leads you to a certain conclusion. And everything is in the core seichel. Because even when the inclination, we said it's an intellectual inclination. It's not because he suddenly got emotional about it. The only thing, it's not pure intellect that has no inclination. It's the seichel that led you to a inclination to something. Etzem seichel is in the world where everything goes. Every possibility. Yeah, it's above. It's like when you're still in a state where you haven't come to any type of inclination. Now it goes back to rotzen. Like when we say that the rotzen, the desire, matas hanefesh, is draws mata, inclines the soul to a certain direction. Because he said, what did I say? Matim. What did I say? Matim? Oh, I didn't say okay, matim. Okay, because looked at me like a nun vav on my glasses. Like matis has nefesh. Matim. Yeah, matim as era seichel. Because he said before in the parentheses, remember that rotzen is like midas and tainug is like chachma, is like wisdom. So he's saying, how does this parentheses add anything? So it's like the rotzen, when a person wants something, so that inclines your soul in that direction. Same thing, the midas matim es era seichel. So it's not because there's an emotional reaction. It's simply that the logic, the mid and the meichen is telling you that this seems to be the right intellectual conclusion. In other words, if there was no midas and meichen altogether, you would just constantly go around in circles. You never come to any conclusion. So there is an element in meichen that has midas in it, not excitement of midas, but midas as in concrete. Because we said, remember, seichel is abstract. Seichel goes inward to the etzem. Midas is about application. So the application within the mind, that's the midas shebameichen. So application is what brings it, not because of an excitement. Excitement is a whole different level of midas. He's basically distinguished, it's completely unrelated. The midas shebameichen, that your mind gets excited about something, is not what we're talking about here. The second level here. That's what he's saying here. Okay, very good.
So the same way,
wow.
Nefesh is higher than Ratzin, but nevertheless, Ratzin is Mates and Nefesh. The same way that Midas is Mates.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, Nefesh is equivalent to Etzem HaSeichel, and Ratzin is equivalent to the Midas. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, he's more explanation what means Ratzon Matas HaNefesh. He's clearly referring to a whole sugya, a subject where we see that. Like he says, but Kitzer. Amnam Yisrael Saba V'Tvuna Hu Parts of HaMechen Hein Midah Shebemechen. Yisrael Saba V'Tvuna, which is is higher than Yisrael Zuta, is the Partzuf, it's the configuration, it's the structure of intelligence, and these are the midas within intelligence. Yisrael Saba Midah Shebechachma V'Tvuna Midah Shebebina. He said that already. Yeah, that's is Midah Shebechachma, and Tvuna is the Midah Shebebina. It says in the beginning of the chapter. Yeah. Kihine yesh beis b'chinas midah shebemechen. Ha'echad is spailas sichli. One is simply intellectual excitement, essentially. Yeah, Ubezei yesh gam ken chesed gvurim ugulim v'hainu shem b'shah asoga nirgish hayeker. And this itself, like you said in the parentheses, there are two levels. In this first level itself, that during the contemplation he's feeling the preciousness, and a concealed because he's so preoccupied in the depth of the idea, he doesn't feel, sense any preciousness, he's just in the moment.
And that's only the level of Yispailus.
Right.
Wow.
And second is midas that have nothing to do with excitement, it's just an inclination of the mind. The etzimin hamidas swatiya vispashus. Core personality of midas, of emotions, is an inclination and an extension. The parentheses, he's saying it here now.
Right.
And this is like the atiyas etzem seichel, like the core seichel, like the rotzen, it's drawing down the core soul. This just confirms what I said, that he wanted to explain how Michin and Midas is like rotzen and tainug in the.
Wow.
Tainug and rotzen. 1 second. That in the core intelligence he came to a midah, to an inclination. This is the Yisrael Saba. The midas and chachma is that it comes to it through a certain resonance and truth.
Oh, it's right.
Right? He knows it's right. He senses. And bina is from the contemplation and the actual depth of the concept that he comes to this inclination. So we just concluded chapter 135, page 262 and 263.